The Diary of Anne Frank by Frances Goodrich and Albert Hackett. Act 1, Scene 3, Last Half. Mr. Van Dam turns to meet Meep, but it is not Meep who comes up the steps. It is Mr. Crawler, followed by Mr. Frank. Their faces are grave. Anne comes from the bedroom. Peter comes from his room. Mrs. Frank, Mr. Crawler. Mr. Van Dam, how are you, Mr. Crawler? Margot, this is a surprise. Mrs. Frank, when Mr. Crawler comes, the sun begins to shine. Mr. Van Dam, Meep is coming? Mr. Crawler, not tonight. Crawler goes to Margot and Mrs. Frank and Anne, shaking hands with them. Mrs. Frank, wouldn't you like a cup of coffee? Or better still, will you have supper with us? Mr. Frank, Mr. Crawler has something to talk over with us. Something has happened, he says, which demands an immediate decision. Mrs. Frank, fearful. What is it? Mr. Crawler sits down on the couch. As he talks, he takes bread, cabbages, milk, etc. from his briefcase, giving them to Margot and Anne to put away. Mr. Crawler, usually when I come up here, I try to bring you some good news. But what's the use of telling you the bad news when there's nothing you can do about it? But today something has happened. Dirk, Meep's Dirk, you know, came to me just now. He tells me that he has a Jewish friend living near him, a dentist. He says he's in trouble. He begged me, could I do anything for this man? Could I find him a hiding place? So I've come to you. I know it's a terrible thing to ask of you, living as you are, but would you take him in with you? Mr. Frank, of course we will. Mr. Crawler, rising. It'll just be for a night or two, until I find some other place. This happened so suddenly that I didn't know where to turn. Mr. Frank, where is he? Mr. Crawler, downstairs in the office. Mr. Frank, good, bring him up. Mr. Crawler, his name is Dussel, Jan Dussel. Mr. Frank, Dussel, I think I know him. Mr. Crawler, I'll get him. He goes quickly down the steps and out. Mr. Frank suddenly becomes conscious of the others. Mr. Frank, forgive me, I spoke without consulting you, but I knew you'd feel as I do. Mr. Van Dam, there's no reason for you to consult anyone. This is your place. You have a right to do exactly as you please. The only thing I feel, there is so little food as it is, and to take in another person. Peter turns away, ashamed of his father. Mr. Frank, we can stretch the food a little. It's only for a few days. Mr. Van Dam, you want to make a bet? Mrs. Frank, I think it's fine to have him. But Otto, where are you going to put him? Where? Peter, he can have my bed. I can sleep on the floor. I wouldn't mind. Mr. Frank, that's good of you, Peter, but your room's too small even for you. Anne, I have a much better idea. I'll come in here with you and Mother, and Margot can take Peter's room, and Peter can go in our room with Mr. Dussel. Margot, that's right, we could do that. Mr. Frank, no, Margot, you mustn't sleep in that room. Neither you nor Anne. Mooshy has caught some rats in there. Peter's brave, he doesn't mind. Anne, then how about this? I'll come in here with you and Mother, and Mr. Dussel can have my bed. Mrs. Frank, no, no, no. Margot will come in here with us, and he can have her bed. It's the only way. Margot, bring your things in here. Help her, Anne. Margot hurries into her room to get her things. Anne to her mother, why, Margot? Why can't I come in here? Mrs. Frank, because it wouldn't be proper for Margot to sleep with a... Please, Anne, don't argue, please. Anne starts slowly away. Mr. Frank to Anne, you don't mind sharing your room with Mr. Dussel, do you, Anne? Anne, no, no, of course not. Mr. Frank, good. Anne goes off into her bedroom, helping Margot. Mr. Frank starts to search in the cupboards. Where's the cognac? Mrs. Frank, it's there. But Otto, I was saving it in case of illness. Mr. Frank, I think we couldn't find a better time to use it. Peter, will you get 5 glasses for me? Peter goes for the glasses. Margot comes out of her bedroom carrying her possessions, which she hangs behind a curtain in the main room. Mr. Frank finds the cognac and pours it into the 5 glasses that Peter brings him. Mr. Van Dam stands looking sourly. Mrs. Van Dam comes downstairs and looks around at all the bustle. Mrs. Van Dam, what's happening? What's going on? Mr. Van Dam, someone's moving in with us. Mrs. Van Dam, in here? You're joking. Margot, it's only for a night or two, until Mr. Crawler finds him another place. Mr. Van Dam, yeah. Mr. Frank hurries over as Mr. Crawler and Dussel come up. Dussel is a man in his late 50s, meticulous, finicky, bewildered now. He wears a raincoat. He carries a briefcase stuffed full and a small medical case. Mr. Frank, come in, Mr. Dussel. Mr. Crawler, this is Mr. Frank. Dussel, Mr. Otto Frank? Mr. Frank, yes. Let me take your things. He takes the hat and briefcase, but Dussel clings to his medicine case. This is my wife Edith, Mr. and Mrs. Van Dam, their son Peter, and my daughters Margot and Anne. Dussel shakes hands with everyone. Mr. Crawler, thank you, Mr. Frank. Thank you all, Mr. Dussel. I leave you in good hands. Oh, Dirk's coat. Dussel hurriedly takes off the raincoat, giving it to Mr. Crawler. Underneath is a white dentist's jacket with a yellow Star of David on it. Dussel to Mr. Crawler, what can I say to thank you? Mrs. Frank to Dussel, Mr. Crawler and Meep, they're our lifeline. Without them we couldn't live. Mr. Crawler, please, you make us seem very heroic. It isn't that at all. We simply don't like the Nazis. To Mr. Frank, who offers him a drink, no, thanks. Then going on, we don't like their methods. We don't like... Mr. Frank, smiling, I know. No one's going to tell us Dutchmen what to do with our Jews. Mr. Crawler to Dussel, pay no attention to Mr. Frank. I'll be up tomorrow to see that they're treating you right. To Mr. Frank, don't trouble to come down. Peter will bolt the door after me, won't you, Peter? Peter, yes, sir. Mr. Frank, thank you, Peter. I'll do it. Mr. Crawler, good night. Group, good night, Mr. Crawler. We'll see you tomorrow, etc., etc. Mr. Crawler goes out with Mr. Frank. Mrs. Frank gives each one of the grown-ups a glass of cognac. Mrs. Frank, please, Mr. Dussel, sit down. Mr. Dussel sinks into a chair. Mrs. Frank gives him a glass of cognac. Dussel, I'm dreaming. I know it. I can't believe my eyes. Mr. Otto Frank here. To Mrs. Frank, you're not in Switzerland, then? A woman told me. She said she'd gone to your house. The door was open. Everything was in disorder. Dishes in the sink. She said she found a piece of paper in the wastebasket with an address scribbled on it, an address in Zurich. She said you must have escaped to Zurich. And Father put that there purposely, just so people would think that very thing. Dussel, and you've been here all the time? Mrs. Frank, all the time, ever since July. Anne speaks to her father as he comes back. Anne, it worked, Pim, the address you left. Mr. Dussel says that people believe we escaped to Switzerland. Mr. Frank, I'm glad. And now let's have a little drink to welcome Mr. Dussel. Before they can drink, Mr. Dussel bolts his drink. Mr. Frank smiles and raises his glass. To Mr. Dussel, welcome. We're very honored to have you here with us. Mrs. Frank, to Mr. Dussel, welcome. The Van Dams murmur a welcome. The grown-ups drink. Mrs. Van Dam, that was good. Mr. Van Dam, did Mr. Crawler warn you that you won't get much to eat here? You can imagine 3 ration books among the 7 of us. And now you make 8. Peter walks away, humiliated. Outside, a street organ is heard dimly. Dussel, rising. Mr. Van Dam, you don't realize what is happening outside that you should warn me of a thing like that. You don't realize what's going on. As Mr. Van Dam starts his characteristic pacing, Dussel turns to speak to the others. Right here in Amsterdam, every day hundreds of Jews disappear. They surround a block and search house by house. Children come home from school to find their parents gone. Hundreds are being deported, people that you and I know. The Hallensteins, the Vessels. Mrs. Frank, in tears, oh, no. Dussel, they get their call-up notice. Come to the Jewish theater on such and such a day and hour. Bring only what you can carry in a rucksack. And if you refuse the call-up notice, then they come and drag you from your home and ship you off to Mundhausen, the death camp. Mrs. Frank, we didn't know that things had got so much worse. Dussel, forgive me for speaking so. Anne, coming to Dussel. Do you know the de Walls? What's become of them? Their daughter Joppy and I are in the same class. Joppy's my best friend. Dussel. They are gone. Anne, gone? Dussel, with all the others. Anne, oh no, not Joppy. She turns away in tears. Mrs. Frank motions to Margot to comfort her. Margot goes to Anne, putting her arms comfortingly around her. Mrs. Van Dam. There were some people called Wagner. They lived near us. Mr. Frank, interrupting with a glance at Anne. I think we should put this off until later. We all have many questions we want to ask, but I'm sure that Mr. Dussel would like to get settled before supper. Dussel, thank you, I would. I brought very little with me. Mr. Frank, giving him his hat and briefcase. I'm sorry we can't give you a room alone, but I hope you won't be too uncomfortable. We've had to make strict rules here, a schedule of hours. We'll tell you after supper. Anne, would you like to take Mr. Dussel to his room? Anne, controlling her tears. If you'll come with me, Mr. Dussel. She starts for her room. Dussel, shaking hands with each in turn. Forgive me if I haven't really expressed my gratitude to all of you. This has been such a shock to me. I'd always thought of myself as Dutch. I was born in Holland. My father was born in Holland, and my grandfather. And now, after all these years, he breaks off. If you'll excuse me. Dussel gives a little bow and hurries off after Anne. Mr. Frank and the others are subdued. Anne, turning on the light. Well, here we are. Dussel looks around the room. In the main room, Margot speaks to her mother. Margot, the news sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? It's so different from what Mr. Crawler tells us. Mr. Crawler says things are improving. Mr. Van Dam, I like it better the way Crawler tells it. They resume their occupations quietly. Peter goes off into his room. In Anne's room, Anne turns to Dussel. You're going to share the room with me. Dussel, I'm a man who's always lived alone. I haven't had to adjust myself to others. I hope you'll bear with me until I learn. Anne, let me help you. She takes his briefcase. Do you always live all alone? Have you no family at all? Dussel, no one. He opens his medicine case and spreads his bottles on the dressing table. Anne, how dreadful. You must be terribly lonely. Dussel, I'm used to it. Anne, I don't think I could ever get used to it. Didn't you even have a pet, a cat or a dog? Dussel, I have an allergy for fur-bearing animals. They give me asthma. Anne, oh dear, Peter has a cat. Dussel, here? He has it here? Anne, yes, but we hardly ever see it. He keeps it in his room all the time. I'm sure it will be all right. Dussel, let us hope so. He takes some pills to fortify himself. Anne, that's Margot's bed, where you're going to sleep. I sleep on the sofa there, indicating the clothes hooks on the wall. We cleared these off for your things. She goes over to the window. The best part about this room, you can look down and see a bit of the street and the canal. There's a houseboat. You can see the end of it. A bargeman lives there with his family. They have a baby, and he's just beginning to walk, and I'm so afraid he's going to fall into the canal some day. I watch him. Dussel interrupting. Your father spoke of a schedule. Anne, coming away from the window. Oh, yes. It's mostly about the times we have to be quiet, and times for the WC. You can use it now if you like. Dussel, stiffly. No, thank you. Anne, I suppose you think it's awful my talking about a thing like that, but you don't know how important it can get to be, especially when you're frightened. About this room, the way Margot and I did. She had it to herself in the afternoons for studying, reading, lessons, you know, and I took the mornings. Would that be all right with you? Dussel, I'm not my best in the morning. Anne, you stay here in the mornings then, and I'll take the room in the afternoons. Dussel, tell me, when you're in here, what happens to me? Where am I spending my time? In there with all the people? Anne, yes. Dussel, I see. Anne, we have supper at 6:30. Dussel, going over to the sofa. Then if you don't mind, I'd like to lie down quietly for 10 minutes before eating. I find it helps the digestion. Anne, of course. I hope I'm not going to be too much of a bother to you. I seem to be able to get up everyone's back. Dussel lies down on the sofa, curled up, his back to her. Dussel, I always get along very well with children. My patients all bring their children to me because they know I get on well with them. So don't you worry about that. Anne leans over, taking his hand and shaking it gratefully. Anne, thank you, Mr. Dussel. The lights dim to darkness. The curtain falls on the scene. Anne's voice comes to us faintly at first, and then with increasing power. Anne's voice. And yesterday I finished Sissy van Marksvelt's latest book. I think she's a first-class writer. I shall definitely let my children read her. Monday, the 21st of September, 1942. Mr. Dussel and I had another battle yesterday. Yes, Mr. Dussel. According to him, nothing, I repeat, nothing is right about me. My appearance, my character, my manners. While he was going on at me, I thought, sometime I'll give you such a smack that you'll fly right up to the ceiling. Why is it that every grown-up thinks they know the way to bring up children, particularly the grown-ups that never had any? I keep wishing that Peter was a girl instead of a boy. Then I would have someone to talk to. Margot's a darling, but she takes everything too seriously. To pause for the moment on the subject of Mrs. Van Dam, I must tell you that her attempts to flirt with father are getting her nowhere. Pym, thank goodness, won't play. As she is saying the last lines, the curtain rises on the darkened scene. Anne's voice fades out.